It's a huge pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Thomas Archambaud, who is a PhD candidate at the University of Glasgow. Thomas's thesis focuses on the integration of the Clan Macpherson into the British Empire and into India in particular between 1760 and 1810. His doctoral research is co-supervised with the Centre Roland Munier at the Sorbonne in France, and it's been supported by a Scottish Graduate School for Arts and Humanities funding, which is a very impressive thing in this day and age. There are 2 articles on the Macphersons in Badenoch and their relations to King's College Aberdeen, soon appearing in the Journal for Irish and Scottish Studies and also Northern Scotland. So very much looking forward to that. But tonight, Thomas will be talking about officers, scholars and Nabobs, the Clan Macpherson in India. So over to you, Thomas.
Thanks a lot, Jim, and thanks for everyone who actually wanted to come today on a Saturday night. So really appreciate that, you know, for all the things to do on a Saturday evening. I will just start sharing my screen, if that's okay. Yeah, here we go. I'm trying, yeah. What's the, bit confused, sorry. Yeah, okay. So I would like to start here in Kolkata. What you can see is the National Library of India since the 1950s and the former official residency of the Governor General of Bengal. It's what was called at the time Calcutta. Belvedere House in Alipur was built by a governor of India, what's called Warren Hastings, in 1778. He actually owned the palace personally, so it was his own property. This place, in a very distinctive European neoclassical style, hosted all governor generals of India until Lord Wellesley, the brother of the more famous Duke of Wellington, decided to move the headquarters to a palace built by the Scottish architects, the brothers Adams, in 1799. The question you may ask, what's the connection with the Macphersons here? The connection is that it was within these halls that Warren Hastings' successor, Sir John Macpherson, ran British India from 1785 to 1786. He was a regular attendant of that place as a close collaborator of Warren Hastings. This man was born on the Isle of Skye. As I said, member of the Supreme Council of the East India Company. I will come back to this. He was also an MP in Westminster, so a huge political figure of the times. He was born on the Slate Peninsula in a family of Gaelic Enlightenment scholars, very distinguished family. John Macpherson was born in 1744, and his father, Reverend John Macpherson of Slate, was a close collaborator of James Macpherson, especially during the creation or the translation of the Oceanic epic. John was educated in King's College in Aberdeen before going out to India on the ship commanded by his uncle, Colonel Macleod of Bernera, in 1767. He landed in Madras, now it's known as Chennai, where John joined the East India Company. The East India Company was a trading company of merchants. It functioned through a royal charter issued directly by the Crown. So we need to think of, it's actually an association of British merchants. So it's not the British state, but at the same time, it's a monopoly over the trade in India and Eastern Asia. Hugely powerful at the time. We will come back to this. So John started at the bottom of the company establishment. That's something to remember, first as a writer, then working as an informal advisor to Mongol princes, to local Indian princes, an activity which is seen as quite dubious, causing lots of disturbances, interferences. So it means that he was actually acting as a go-between the company and the Mongol princes. John's career
it should be a new Zoom invite. I've just sent it now.
John's career was actually quite successful, but not that straightforward. He was dismissed twice from the company. In 1787, he was forced to resign over a huge scandal over his participation in financial scandals in India, dealing again with the complex relations between the Mongol princes and the British government. His successor, the Earl of Cornwallis, you might know him from his participation during the American War of Independence. Cornwallis described his administration, as a system of the dustiest jobbing. But as we will see, his administration needs to be reevaluated, was very effective and successful, even albeit short-lived. So the missing piece in the jigsaw, if I may say, was how did we end up with this person in Calcutta, in what is now the National Library of India? The missing piece in the jigsaw is the more famous James Ossian Macpherson. Here you've got a lovely portrait by David Martin from private collection. And opposite, quite an interesting portrait of John Macpherson during his Calcutta years, or slightly after, by an artist who was really involved in India at the time, is Osius Humphrey. So it's 1786. It could be actually later. So here we need to turn to Badenoch more and forget more about the Skye connection, because unlike John, James was a native of Bray Ruven, opposing the Ruven barracks. You can still see the remnants of the township today. He's chiefly remembered as the creator, the forger, if we may say so, of the poems of Ossian, appearing in print between 1760 and 1773. And the poems generated a huge controversy on the authenticity of the poems, presumably translated from the original Gaelic verse of the bard Ossian. What is often forgotten about him is that he was incredibly successful and gifted as a writer, as an historian, but he's also a politician, deeply involved in the business of the East India Company. He was first employed as pro-governmental writer, meaning that he was paid to write pamphlets defending the British state, especially during the war with the American colonies in the 1770s. He was an MP in Westminster. Don't look for a Scottish constituency, because he was elected in Campbellford in Cornwall, according to the custom, the practices of the time, what we called a rotten borough or pocket borough, meaning that you will have only maybe 3 or 4 people voting in the area, and it was basically you will send your candidate, as if you were a prominent politician or patron, you will send a candidate there, and you will make sure that he got elected. He never traveled to India, which is a bit frustrating for us, but it doesn't mean he wasn't involved in this. He was involved from the East India House in London on Lindenhall Street. That's hugely powerful. That's very important, because this is where most of the decisions were made. So we need to think, I will come back to this, but when we think about British India at the time, we are before the times of the Raj. That's the East India Company assuming huge territorial sovereignty on India. And different centers of gravity, the center of power at the time. We've got Madras, Chennai today. That's where the headquarters of the East India Company was, the council, the Supreme Council. Kolkata was the Governor General, so it's really the sort of imperial capital there. And London was a huge financial, political center of decision. What is of interest here is James Macpherson's prominent position in providing his Badenoch kinsmen with opportunities in the army. So it's either the British Army or the East India Company. As you might be aware, there has been huge patterns, long tradition of patterns of immigration from the Highlands to the British Empire, especially for army recruitments, for a multitude of reasons. Economically, life was quite hard. We know that it's quite difficult, especially in Badenoch, which is called the White Black Country. It's quite difficult to make a living out of the soil. There's a book by an historian, Andrew MacCallum, looking at the army recruitment in that area. And in his book, the title of the book is quite revealing. It says, more fruitful than the soil. So it means that people had to move to make a living. It was also political, seeking a sort of rehabilitation for after the Jacobite rebellion of 1745. The Macphersons were quite a divided clan, but the important thing is that the clan chief, Ewan Macpherson of Cluny, took part in the rebellion on the Jacobite side. He had his estate confiscated, and his son was reputedly born in a corn kiln, and he could not assume the title of chief. So that's something important to remember for the rest of the story. The reason for the booming opportunities of the Scots in India has never failed to amaze commentators, historians, the public at the very time, at that time, but also today. That's very important. The Scotophobia was huge in London at the time, especially at the time of James Macpherson, the Oceanic publications. What is even more interesting is that this Scotophobia was strongly linked to the overrepresentation of Scots in the British Empire, and particularly in India. Among the many factors explaining the prominence of Scots in India, we've got different advantages that Scotland had. The first one was the prestige of the Highland soldier, of Highland military values. It's a commonplace thing in literature. It was supported by a whole range of works, from Macpherson's Ossian to Walter Scott. Even today, think of the kilted regiments, etc. Secondly, is the excellence of Scottish education. And I think it's worth mentioning that in Brereuvin, there was a grammar school that Macpherson attended. After his studies in James Macpherson attended. After he returned from Edinburgh, he taught there for a very short period of time, and especially through what they call the Scottish Society for the Preservation of Christian Knowledge, the SSPCK, responsible for a huge network of schools. That's very important, because knowledge in a country deprived of, I would say, a huge financial capital, human capital was key, and cultural capital was key as well. And James Macpherson himself never went to India, officially never involved in, I will say, the dirty business of wars, exploitation, was actually part of that recreation of the Scottish Highlands, but also in the recreation of British India and India at that time. So you can remember these elements: army, trade. We can also mention medicine. Medicine was important. 3 of the first 5 Directors Generals of the Indian Medical Service of the Raj were Scots, and among them there was one Macpherson. I will come back to him later. So to give you just a measure of, I would like to give you a measure of the success. Here we go. We can have a look at the database of Macpherson serving in India. Here's only maybe, I would say, just 1/3 of the final database. It's not something to be taken for granted now, because we've got lots of namesakes, people bearing the same names, etc., etc., because it comes from different sources. But from here, it's a database basically ranging from the 7 Years' War to the eve of the 19th century. Lots of conflicts. The graphs indicated this, if you can see, the surname of the first name, the parish, the place of origin, date of birth, date of death, social status. It's sometimes a bit complicated. Appointment dates, appointment places, profession, patronage. That's very important, because we are in a time, it's I would say, pre-bureaucratic. There was a bureaucracy in India, but the way you will get these jobs, especially as writers or cadets, will be through patronage. So basically, someone accepting to forward you, to channel you through the whole system. And the patronage system was incredibly aristocratic at the time. If we look at this, and again, it's provisional. So, but for the period 1757, 1799, I've been able to find approximately 30 Macphersons, maybe a bit less, in army, military service. That's huge. If you compare this to traditional patronage networks like the Argyle, etc., etc., it's even a bit more. We need also to remember that it's only for a short period of time, because John Macpherson's time as Governor General ended in 1787, and after that, the Macpherson never really recovered the same powerful patronage, prestige, and I will say even ascendancy on the Supreme Council that they had. But I think it gives an interesting snapshot of their success, especially in the military service. So what were what were the consequences for Badenoch? And this is where we will encounter one of the three words I mentioned in the title, Nabobs. Nabobs was actually a derivation from an Indian term, a Mongol term. A nabob was a term used in the press at the time, incredibly loaded with bad connotations. So it means that someone who came back to India, made a lot of money, and reinjected the money in the landscape to buy an estate, or for its own enjoyment, or for his family, or for his clan. And this is where we see, basically, it's not just a single way. We need to think that these Macphersons who moved to India were mostly young men, unmarried. They will go to India. We need to think about the climate. Wasn't quite a test for Scots at the time, but also the military service. When we think about the wars there, lots of them. So the consequences was huge. The consequences were huge, sorry, for James Macpherson, because he came back in 1790 as a wealthy landowner. So he came back from London, and he resettled in Badenoch, where he displayed his incredible success and fortune. He had two sons who would serve in India, so it means that he also passed his estate over time. The origin of Macpherson's landed estate was the Arcot estate. What you can see here is a wonderful watercolor of the palace of the late Nabob of Arcot. The Nabob of Arcot was, if you take it geographically, it looks quite minor on the map, because the Mongol Empire collapsed in the 1750s. The British wanted to take over, but the thing is that instead of having the Mongol Empire replaced by British rule, what they had was Britain's quite fragile and weak position, because we had to think, how could we put forward trade interests and political interests? And the main answer was through collaboration with these regimes. Collaboration was not there was no single solution to it. The problem is that these princes were hugely powerful, and the Nawab was one of them. He was a close ally of the British, and James Macpherson acted as his London agent for a number of years. And John Macpherson, remember the one who was Governor General of India from 1785 and 1786, he was dismissed from the company. They forced him to resign because he was too close to the Nawab of Arcot. And people in the court of directors in London thought that John was actually putting in the interest of Nawab before the interest of the British state and the British East India Company. And I love this portrait. We've got the portrait of Nawab in the middle. That's from the National Galleries in Edinburgh. And here we've got, again in private collection, the portraits of two sons of the Nawab of Arcot. And as usual, you will see the British state interfering into dynasties, etc. So you will have one pro-British, which was Umdat ul-Amara, and Ami ul-Amara was basically trying to find accommodation with the French or the Dutch. So you see, it's a usually complicated picture. If we go back to Belleville House, the home of James Macpherson, the house is still standing today. I might be wrong, but it's no longer in Macpherson ownership, from what I know. The origin of the landed estate of Macpherson, James Macpherson bought the old Wraiths estate, but he renamed Belleville as a fashionable name. And the money originated from a bond from the Nawab of Arcot of £20,000. That's a huge sum of money. It's approximately £1,720,000 today. So you see, it's a huge amount of money. It also should be said, it's not just the money of Arcot. It's also the money derived from the publications, because Ocean was caused a huge stir in the Republic of Letters. Lots of copies sold. It's incredible. And also money derived from his pension as a pamphleteer in London. The other benefits derived from the incredible success in India of the Macphersons, because one person was very interested in that success, is Duncan Macpherson of Cluny. So that's the gentleman you see on the right-hand side. Remember, he was the son of Ewan Macpherson of Cluny. the chief who took part in Jacobite rebellion, was forced to exile. He went to exile. Duncan was deprived of lands, so he was deprived of revenues. But he served in America, and it served as a sort of rehabilitation, serving in British regiments during the War of Independence. When he came back in 1784, he had his estate restored to him. There was a local rumor circulating at the time, and it's something which actually remains in books, that the Cluny estate was given to James Macpherson and not to Duncan Macpherson. This is quite unlikely, given the fact that usually the state will give the estate back to the patrimonial descent, so the nearest male, and it will be Duncan Macpherson. And from the letters I've been able to read, the correspondence of James Macpherson, we know that James Macpherson never coveted the estate for himself. He was far too clever for that. He also knew that his money came from India, so there was no point squeezing revenues from the land and making huge improvements, something like that. What he knew is that he wanted the chief to be back as a symbolic power, and that's very important. In that sense, we know that James Macpherson lobbied the London government, especially a man very important at the time, Henry Dundas, Viscount Melville. He was called the uncrowned king of Scotland. And because of James Macpherson's prominent place in Indian politics, we need to remember that India was the jewel of the crown, but it was clear this is where money actually came from, Jamaica as well, but India was very important. So what James did at the time was lobbying the London establishment to be sure that Duncan will get the lands back. There was a fourth man, if we take Sir John Macpherson into account, is Alan Macpherson of Blairgowrie, the actual what I call the actual warrior. Not quite sure about the title, but I was trying to think about geography and maybe the symbolic geographies of the clan reconfiguration, because we are, in a certain sense, in a post-clan landscape in many respects. Alan Macpherson of Blairgowrie grew up with James, very close friends. They were cousins, second cousins. And Alan was also in India. He was an interpreter. He was also a military man, usually successful. And he wanted to do the same thing. He wanted to be a nabob. So he came back to Bednar, and he wanted to buy an estate in Rates. Problem was James Macpherson already bought it. So he ended up buying an estate in Perthshire. This is where the Blairgowrie Castle is still today. And this is why, because the original Cluny Castle was destroyed. This is why we end up with the clan chief mentioned being outside the Macpherson territory, if I may say so, in Perthshire. That's interesting because we see how complicated and multifaceted James Macpherson was. He was a man who basically he was in charge of the imagination of the clan, of the recreation of the clan. He was the man in charge of patronage, so hugely powerful. But at the same time, he was quite an oddity locally because he was not a soldier. His wealth, his prestige came from Ossian, came from the Enlightenment. If you compare with Duncan, who was actually a warrior, or Alan Macpherson was more a scholar, and we can see that James Macpherson was a different man, and he knew that. It's clear from his letters, especially his letters to Alan Macpherson. Alan was quite disappointed. There is a story, interesting story in the, around the derivation of money, how you repatriate money from India. At the time, you would have what I called official channels of repatriation of money, of capital. He needed to go through London, otherwise you will have serious problems. A good way to do it was to convert this money into diamonds in China, and then you will bring the money back to Europe. This is what Alan Macpherson of Blairgowrie wanted to do. He wasn't the only one to do that, and he was probably quite honest and quite genuine about it. He felt not guilty, but he knew that he was clearly on a fake line there. To do that, they created a trading company, McIntyre and Turnbull. McIntyre was the nephew of James Ossian Macpherson, but the whole firm collapsed, finance and markets, and he lost a lot. He lost huge sums of money, and this was pretty much the end of the relationship between James and Alan Macpherson. Just a bit of context on Alan Macpherson of Blackgarry, because it's worth mentioning for what follows, is this wonderful depiction of a South Indian sepoy and his wife in Tanjore in 1770, because Alan Macpherson commanded battalions of sepoys, and as you will see, sepoys who played a huge role in the stories of Macphersons. James Macpherson died in 1796. He left his estate to his son, not usually popular in the area, mostly because his mum was English and he was born and bred in London. John Macpherson died in 1821 in London, so that's time coming to a close. But as we progress into the 19th century, another important clan connection to India was not Badenoch, but Aberdeen and King's College. So here we will move from Badenoch to Skye again and King's College. You will see why. Sorry. So if we look at Sir John Macpherson's will, as a Governor General of India, huge sums of money, but he died without children. He had to carefully choose his executors in his will. And interestingly, wasn't the family of James Macpherson, his lifelong friend, not his immediate family, Martin Macpherson, his brother, who, like his dad, decided to, who opted for the ministry in the Hebrides, in Skye, in Slate. It was this man, Dr. Hugh Macpherson, the sub-principal of King's College. In the absence of children, the vast majority of Sir John Macpherson's property, passed on to his Aberdeen cousins, rather than his more embedded families. I think it's very important because it shows that the human and imperial dimension mattered more to John than his family connections. In terms of patronage, family is everything, as we will see. And this is a feature of Scottish networks in India. Everything is through family networks. But this is true of English and Welsh people, but it's particularly true of Scots. Dr. Hugh Macpherson is a very interesting character. He was born in 1767. He was the son of a Presbyterian minister from the Hebrides of Golspie. He was a third cousin of Sir John Macpherson, and he developed an early friendship with the Macphersons of Slate. Following the premature death of his father, Hugh found in the house of Martin Macpherson, John's brother, a second home. He was a scholar highly regarded in his own time, very much a product of the European scientific enlightenment. He studied in Aberdeen, Edinburgh, London, but also Paris. In the 1780s, he detached himself from medicine, and he turned to Greek literature. That's an interesting crossover. He was appointed professor at the professorship of Oriental languages, but he never gave up the practice of medicine. He died in Aberdeen, what you can see here is his grave in Old Mackar's graveyard in Aberdeen. Hugh was more an institutional figure than an ivory tower scholar. He was more a sort of political man than a man of the books. There are lots of funny anecdotes about Dr. Hugh Macpherson's. It seems that after his appointment at the chair of Hebrew, the senators of King's College forced him to go on annual leave in London, I quote, in order to qualify more properly for the discharge of his office. Contemporaries remembered that he was very aware of his limitations, and that he started every year by saying to his class, "Gentlemen, I am only one lesson ahead of you." So he seemed to have been more successful in academic business, especially in preserving the interdependence of King's College at a time where they were discussing the merging of Marshall College and King's College. So in picking Dr. Hugh Macpherson, John Macpherson highlights 3 key elements of the success in India of the clan. One is a global understanding of the clanship. It's not just Badenor, it's not just Skye, it's all over Scotland. It's like an extension of clanship, if you like. Secondly, it's paving the way for a more, I would say, permanent presence in India. What we had until then were sojourners, so young people moving to India, making profits, repatriating money. Some of them were amazing scholars. They spoke so many languages, but never came to the mind the idea of staying there for life. With the Raj, and especially the 19th century and what I call the Aberdeen Skye Macphersons, if you like, it's completely different. These people will stay longer in Scotland. Here you can see Christina, who is his second wife, the daughter of Principal Macleod, and Roderick Macleod was also a native of Skye, was from Talisker. And that's very interesting because one of the most prominent people in King's College at the time were natives of the Isle of Skye. It means that for patronage, for the people who studied there, who studied in Aberdeen, having someone like Roderick Macleod was a huge advantage, obviously. There is a sketch by John Kay that I really like. It's a satire, obviously, of a few teachers, a few professors from King's College. And you can see Roderick Macleod here, the father-in-law of Hugh Macpherson, wearing a kilt under the yellow star. He was a very, very close friend of Sir John Macpherson. And if you look carefully here, there is a comment, a small note. Annually for 5 years and upwards have I beat up even to the Ultima Thule, have I recruited our university. Beat up is a reference to beat up the drum. So it's a reference to army recruitment. Ultima Thule was a Latin word used to refer to the world or the northern part. So it's interesting mix of I would say global connections, but also Hebrides and the Western Isles here. So you see, Roderick Macleod was very influential in recruiting people in India. Here we've got an illustration in this map. So as you can see, if we want to understand how this Macpherson ended up in India, we need to think about the local areas, where they came from, and how this distributed in terms of universities and patronage. So you've got Roderick Macleod of Talisker from Skye, from the Slate Peninsula, Sir John Macpherson, Dr. Hugh Macpherson, the Macleods of Bernera, so that's the metal family of Sir John Macpherson, and Dr. Hugh Macpherson, the Greek professor who actually bought the Isle of Egg. So you see, there's an history. They wanted to maintain a close link to the Scottish Islands in a way. Dr. Hugh Macpherson's had 7 sons. Only one never traveled, lived or worked in India. That's a huge proportion. Among all of Dr. Hugh Macpherson's children, the more interesting, and at least in my opinion, is someone called Samuel Charters Macpherson. Charters is the name of the maiden name of his mum. He was a military officer, a pioneering scholar, and a gifted political agent. He gives a good example of the multifaceted participation of the Macphersons in Britain expansions in India. It's also interesting because he lived at a time, a defining moment, where the East India Company, we moved from an East India Company model to a British centralized model. And in the middle of that, there was the Sepoy Rebellion of 1857. Samuel was appointed collector of Ganjam, as you can see here, the red arrow, a town and state, then part of the Presidency of Madras and situated in the northeast of India. It's a district created in 1802. Ganjam offers a good summary of the challenges of Britain in the 1830s and the 1840s, because it was a state emerging from the disintegration of the Mongol Empire, but it was violently fractured and destabilized by the British conquest, where legal basis was actually uncertain. What the British government wanted to introduce was a transformation of a fragmented empire of variable sizes, governance and dependence towards the British, into a more centralized bureaucratic empire. And Samuel Charles Macpherson took part in that transformation. In the 1830s, the British administration in Bengal had an interest for what we call surveying and mapping India. It's something to remember that the knowledge of India has always been a complicated issue for the British, mainly for matters of linguistic. This is why someone like Samuel Charles Macpherson had to learn Sanskrit, but also Persian, the language of the Mongol administration, Hindu, etc., etc. And for trade is the same thing. So we need to think of India maybe less as a sort of Mongol place conquered by the British, but more as a sort of fairly European and diverse. And within that framework, within that world, the British had to find their way. And the only way to find their way was in a weird combination of tactics of terror, war, destructions, intimidation, intrusion into these autonomous Mongol princely states, and pragmatic arrangements. And Samuel is a good example of that. He was part of the surveyors sent all over India in order to produce a proper British official map. And again, his profile was very interesting. He was a product of the Aberdeen Enlightenment. He was a legal scholar, but also a military officer, demonstrating the very pragmatic objectives of the survey. There is another good example in that region when he worked as collector, so collecting taxes, and a political agent of the region. Samuel was asked to provide the Governor General, the fellow Scot, Lord Elphinstone, with a report on the Aboriginal population, the Gonds, from Gumsur. Published in 1842, his report upon the Gond people, mainly rice cultivators, their language, they spoke Kui, and in the southern part, a dialect called Kui. Religion, a syncretic combination of animism, shamanism, and Hinduism. Social and political structures. The report is particularly interesting because it shows his own ambivalence towards the Gonds, but it also shows the ambivalence of the British towards this newly conquered population. Samuel Macpherson's main interest for the Gonds originated in the discovery of a local practice of human sacrifice called the Meria, but was, according to British officers fighting the king of Gimsur, part of the worship of the earth goddess, the Tari or Dani. Samuel Macpherson was explicitly asked to put an end to the practice. He did it through basically two means. One, offering an animal substitute for the human victims, and two, acting as a go-between and making sure that girls from neighboring populations could be married to young men, thus protecting them from a brutal death. But in fact, this civilizing, almost humanitarian narrative does reflect pragmatic motives and ideologies behind the celebration of British Christian values. Samuel Macpherson's observation of the Gond and of their religion, the Meria sacrifice, he understood something. It was not just religion. It was something about their political community and social cohesion. So if you manage to suppress human sacrifice, you will also manage to put the British in a better position in that part of India. Because you want to understand the enemy, if we may say so, but you also be able to conquer in a different way. Here is an interesting defining moment where you will see different things intersecting. Humanitarian values, Christian values, but also new strategies of conquest. This being said, Samuel he kept a relative freedom from central authority. during his encounter with the Khans. And it's quite interesting to see that he's referring to James Macpherson Ossian when describing the Khans. It was surprisingly sympathetic, and even when comparing to his colleagues and fellow scholars, ahead of his times. In 1837, he drafted a letter, later published in his Memorials of Service in India, where we find his description of his first discovery with the Khans. You can imagine a people distributed into clans, occupying the mountain valleys and plateau of his chain, and existing from the beginning of time, undisturbed by the political and religious revolutions of Hindustan, India. These people we discovered by accident 2 years ago. I found my way through the territories of a number of his fine clans, and so conciliated their goodwill as to get all their chiefs to meet me in confidential intercourse. From then I learned a good many of the most important facts relative to a large portion of his new country and people, and executed a very extensive survey. You could see the rhetoric of the brave new world. So you will portray the Khans as people being actually undiscovered before, which is not true. But at the same time, the reference to clans is very interesting, as you might see, and it's even more interesting when we know that he was a Macpherson himself. He collected stories, and we know from his correspondence that he emulated the example of James Macpherson, James Ossian Macpherson, collecting stories there, especially things related to religion, and even wanted to recreate sort of an epic of sorts, but he never really managed to do it. So as you see, there's interesting. It's interesting because James Ossian Macpherson never went to India, but there was someone else who tried to apply his experiment, if I may say so. We're actually very lucky to have a wonderful Mongol watercolor of Samuel Charters Macpherson here. He is depicted in conversation with Raja Singh Sopura and Raumoti Lalil Vakil, two Maratha nobles who supported the Sepoy Rebellion of 1857. It's interesting because here we see Samuel's role as an intermediary, as a go-between, his strategy of fitting into pre-existing Mongol diplomatic practices. It's also the end of an era, in a sense. As we can see here, in times of a dislocated Mongol Empire, even Mongol states, we got Samuel Macpherson, the bearded guy, on equal footing with two Sepoy, with two Maratha nobles, at a time when they knew that their time was going to an end. Macpherson was appointed later. He was resident in Gallior, and he found allies within the local elite with someone called Dinkar Dunkar Rao. He was a pro-British administrator. He drew up a code of law, who was a compromise between the penal code, so that was the new pinnacle of British legislation in India at the time, and local practices. He also took an increasing part in managing the finances, officially saving Gwalior from bankruptcy, but also having more direct control on the revenues. And this is what the directors in London were interested in, maximizing the profits. These elements became central with when the high caste sepoys rebelled against their employer, the East India Company, in May 1857. Not much time to say more about it, but this moment, either called the Indian Mutiny in Britain or the First War of Independence of India, you see how polarized the whole thing is. But Samuel Macpherson played a key role there. When the Indian sepoys rebelled, his role in Gwalior was to ensure that the armies will not join the Delhi sepoys. So he acted as an intermediary on different levels, securing through his friendship with Dankar that the personal army of the Nawabs India was well maintained, and that sanctions could be taken if there were any velleities to join the rebels. And he also had to convince the sepoy contingent that there were not benefits from joining the rebellion. He was quite successful, especially in the matters of religion. And remember, Samuel was very interested in religion, and religion was one of the driving force behind the rebellion. It's not the only motive of the rebellion, but this is something very important. So we can see here different things intersecting and depending on each other. He tolerated lots of religious and social practices there. So as you see, it's quite a complicated and multifaceted strategy. Samuel died in April 1860 on his trip from Delhi to Calcutta. His funeral took place there, and he was buried in the Scottish graveyard. Just very briefly, because I'm aware of time, if we want to explore more Macphersons in India in the 19th century, and other sons of Dr. Hugh Macpherson's, the other one would be Sir Arthur Macpherson. And here we got a painting, a photograph, sorry, of the High Court of Calcutta, built in 1761-62, but I think it's 1861. Sorry, there's a mistake. Arthur Macpherson was barrister in the Temple in 1852. He moved to Calcutta in 1862 as legislative secretary to the Bengal government. He participated in the creation of the judicial arsenal, which was meant to offer a new, more centralized basis to the British government. There was also a growing fears about Hindu nationalism at the time, and the possibility of Hindus and Muslims, despite the fact that the Mongols saw the Hindus as conquered people. But there was a fear in 1857 of both of them being able to put a Mongol back on the throne in Delhi, and thus subjugating the rest of India, and will be the end of British India. So as you see, Arthur Macpherson was a very important man at that time. What we can also mention is medicine. Remember, we mentioned medicine at the beginning as one of the fields, the favorite fields of Scots and abroad. Not surprisingly, a brother of Samuel and Arthur Macpherson was a prominent doctor, a surgeon. He was also conscious that the times of the EIC has ended. So he started a prestigious career as a professor at the new University of Calcutta, created in 1857, and he specialized in vaccine inoculation, dysentery, and he published his Annals of Cholera in 1872. I think it's worth mentioning that during the pandemic, there was some news from the Macphersons in a sense. On the NHS website in 2020, you could read a quote from John Macpherson. No question in medicine is more interesting than that of an endemic. So a large number of cases of a particular disease happening at the same time. Taking on the character of an epidemic, a disease that spreads across and affects individuals, and of the behavior of an endemic when its own epidemic form reaches it. Sorry for the very dry quotation, but I think it's interesting in the sense that it clearly reflects global preoccupations today. And I think again that John Macpherson was mentioned on the NHS website in 2020 is again an interesting sense that although it was clearly not present in the mind of the people who used the quotation, but it also shows that the global and imperial connections of Britain are still pretty much there today. Just to finish up very quickly, I would like to depart from Bengal and move to a place associated with the Macphersons in Southeast Asia. As you can see on the picture on the right-hand side, there is a strait. The strait is a narrow passage on water between two pieces of land called the Macpherson Strait. Again, why is there Macpherson Strait? You know, here in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. It's just in the south of Port Blair. Sport the Scottish name again. And it was named after a man called Ranald Macpherson, the company superintendent of convicts and executive engineer at Penang. So this man is very interesting for all sorts of reasons, and I think it's a good way to finish the talk. I think it's a good thing to finish the talk with him, because he was born of the Isle of Skye from John Macpherson, but this John Macpherson was actually from Badenoch. He was John Macpherson from Benchar. He started his career as an EIC cadet, so he went to India. In Madras, he learned Arabic, Persian, normal training. He married Christina Bethune. Again, this is Skye, even Quebec connection. So you see wider imperial connections. He was deployed to China during the First Opium War in 1842. He participated in the capture of Shanghai. And he was posted to the strait settlement of Penang in Malaysia today. Very quickly, Penang is very interesting because it was huge as a trade hub for the opium trade and tea trade. And so that's the first reason why it's worth mentioning. The other reason is that Penang and the the Isles of Prince Edward Island were actually funded by Sir John Macpherson in 1786. He was surely aware of that connection. Wasn't really a very easy job there, because even if since 1804 it was technically part of the presidency of Calcutta, so managed by the central government, in fact, private traders were in a constant state of ruthless competition for opium, especially with the Dutch and the French neighbors there. So Ronald had a very tough time there. All he could do was trying to collect taxes. But as a military person, he wasn't highly regarded by the merchants. In 1860, he moved to Singapore. And in Singapore, his military background was essential because he was appointed colonial secretary, commandant of the Singapore Volunteer Rifles, and honorary colonel in 1864. He supervised the designing and the building of the Anglican Cathedral from 1856. So you see there's an interesting twist here, because he was probably born and raised in a Presbyterian environment. He ended up promoting the values of Anglicanism. It would be worth looking, was it a contradiction for him? Or could he separate the two and think that basically Presbyterian values were important for him as a human being, but as part of the British administration, he had to promote Anglican values. He's also remembered in Singapore for a road, a monument that you can see here. So very, very important. Just to draw a line here, let's leave Southern Asia and let's move to a milder and colder climate, where everything started in Kingussie. I think that most of you will be probably familiar with this monument. It's September 2022. A permanent memorial to the Indian soldiers serving in Force K6, better known as the Indian Contingent, during World War II, was inaugurated in Kingussie. The story told here is the story of Hindu and Muslim troops who fought in Dunkirk between 1940 and 1942. They spent the winter training in Kingussie, in the Cairngorms. 14 soldiers died, and their memories are commemorated on that memorial. This is a brilliant reminder that if the Scots moved abroad, taking part in a complex formation of the East India Company of the Raj, this was far from a one-way journey. Imperialism had left a strong mark on the Highlands, not only in terms of capital and estate management, but also in terms of humans. And I think this is probably the downside of history research, especially socioeconomic research. It's important not to forget the people. And especially in that case, to think that it's also going the other way around. I also see an interesting twist in history. If we remember the infamous repression of the sepoys by the British troops in India in 1857, that initiative gives credit to Badenoch. Many of these men enlisted in the army during World War II would never thought that they would have a chance to see their names on the British monument. Some of them even might have had sepoys ancestors. So in terms of symbol, that's essential. This is also partly a story which remains to be written. Not only the Macphersons of India, who are neither fully angels or demons, but done to have soldiers, nabobs, scholars. It's only justice that they could meet in the fictionalized word of a memorial in Kingussie today with the descendants of Indian sepoys, of people subjugated 2 centuries before. On the Kingussie monument, I quite like the quotation, "We are all Jock Tamson's bairns, all equals at last, after centuries of rural oppression and divisions." This spoke to their ancestors too in the 18th and 19th century, or to quote Stephen Clark's wonderful song, "Coming home to a place they've never been, coming home to a land they've never seen, coming home to a family they have never known, all Jock Tamson's bairns are coming home." Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Thomas. That was awesome. Goodness, so much in there that has sparked a million different ideas in my mind. Not least of which, well, I love the way that you ended that idea of empire coming home. I think that circularity of empire, that interconnectedness is absolutely vital. That's how we understand how empire works. It's always coming back here, always comes back to what happens here. I was particularly startled by your brief mention of Raoul Macpherson and the fact that he was the son of John Macpherson, the factor of the Lord Macdonald estate. And I realized, hang on, he would have been factor when my great-great-grandfather was in Skye, and my great-great-grandfather writes lots of really snotty letters to them saying, stop behaving badly. So goodness, to have that personal connection coming in was great. And goodness, I thought that was such a tremendously rich examination of how we can go from the 18th century right through to the 20th century and see that Macpherson connection with empire. I'm particularly interested in Sir Thomas Stewart Macpherson in the 1920s, 1930s, and what he's doing in Patna in particular. So I thought that was absolutely fascinating to see that trajectory, that consistent line of Macpherson involvement in India and what's going on there. So thank you very much for that. I have a million questions, but I'm conscious that there's an audience out there who also probably wants to ask questions. So do we have any questions for Thomas from our audience, please? And of course, I'm struggling to find where the chat lives on Zoom. I don't usually use Zoom. Anyone tell me if, oh, there it is. There it is. There we go. Excellent. Oh, we have a hand up. Isla.
No, it's not Isla, it's Gertie.
Oh, sorry, Gertie. Sorry. It's confusing.
It's Isla's machine. Oh, we love that talk because we visited India so often and done volunteer work out there. It was absolutely fascinating. The only other question, just hoping we can get a recording of it so that we can pursue more of these issues that you raised. It was just, thank you so very much, Thomas. I endorse that. Yeah.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. I mean, actually, it's. I would love to go to India because you can only speak, from experience. And
yeah.
I'd love to explore. Yeah.
You will one day. You will. And you will visit all these incredible buildings. I mean, buildings, unbelievable, abject poverty, and these elaborate, funded by presumably Indian wealth that funded it. Yes.
I was particularly interested in the transition from originally being military involvement in India and then the civilians coming and playing a part and building up their careers in India, totally detached from the army. I found that transition quite fascinating.
Yeah, it's a very good point, and it's also interesting because I think it was there right from the start, in a sense.
Yeah.
This is the impression I got from these guys like John Macpherson and others. They're sort of guys who will never have only one. They will have their fingers in different pies at the same time. So they will be involved with the diplomacy for one Mongol prince. Sorry, they will be involved in East India companies or trade relations. They will be involved in all sorts of things. So the military was more. It's usually you see the military profession as basically war, but especially in India, it was a gateway to other professions, including diplomacy. And it's interesting. It's something I would love to pursue further in the future. But Sir John Macpherson was a political writer and almost a spy during the French Revolution. And all his contacts were made in India. So when he went to Europe, he visited all his old Indian friends, the Dutch, the French, etc. Not in France because the guillotine was there, so it wasn't really a fun time to be there. But yeah, he visited all French people in exile, Dutch, Germans, etc. All these guys were former VOCs, so the Dutch East India Company officials, etc. So it's interesting. It's also a gateway to Europe, you see, and thinking about the circular way, it's not just India, Britain, Europe. It's everything was combined. And sometimes I don't want to be too political, but sometimes in British political discourse, we tend to think that Britain was centered to, focus of attention was directed towards the British Empire from the end of the 18th century, forgetting about the links to Europe. And yeah, you can. I don't need to mention the obvious parallels with the situation today. I think it's different layers. There's different things happening at the same time, and it's not because Britain was heavily present. Of course, the French were minor presence in India at the time, but at the same time, on the day-to-day basis, you will have to speak French. And it's something linguistically it's very interesting, is Indian languages, but all these Macpherson had to speak Urdu, they had to speak Persian, because that's the language of the administration and the Mongol correspondence, but they also had to speak French, Spanish, Portuguese.
We ask another question.
Yeah.
Yeah. Can are you saying that really the Nabobs and the British East Indian Company, ultimately the Raj, were really bedfellows, and that's why they had both had a vested interest in keeping things under control?
So you mean that the fragile position was because of the atrocities committed in India? Yeah. I mean, I try to end my talk with saying that they were neither demons or angels, and I think it's interesting to see that these people could be subject to incredible poverty at home, and at the same time being the ones committed atrocities in India. And it's, I mean, in terms of the reasons behind the destabilization of India, yes, the atrocities were clearly something, but we also need to think that in the Arcot state, you remember the palace of the Nawab of Arcot. The Nawab of Arcot was a very clever fellow. He knew that, because I didn't have time to explain, but it was a very complex and very smart process, because he needed money, and he needed troops to protect his state against other neighbors. So he actually employed British East India Company servants as his own, sort of Swiss guards were actually Europeans. And also he borrowed money from company servants on a private basis. So you see, it's complicated because he was clearly exploited by the British East India Company. But I'm not talking about the farmers who suffered a lot from these demoniac strategies of land and destructions, etc. But the Nawab of Arcot managed to, I mean, end his life in his own bed. He died peacefully. His sons were remarkably versed into literature, etc. They managed to pursue, their literary interests. So, yeah, but it's clear that the transition from military officers to civilians, as you said, it's also behind this. There's clearly a problem of. There were clearly problems of when you got the tactics of terror all the time.
With survival. Yeah.
Clearly.
Thank you.
A quick one. The name of Thomas Stuart Macpherson was mentioned a short time ago. He was my grandfather.
Okay.
And he
Nice.
joined the Indian Civil Service in the last few years of the 19th century. He rose to the position of High Court judge before he retired in the middle 30s, which I think was an amazing achievement for a person who probably didn't speak a great deal of English until he went to school. But by sheer hard work and diligence, he made his way up.
Okay.
A very interesting person indeed. The other person you have mentioned, what I still call the Indian Mutiny. There was a famous occasion then when two Macphersons won Victoria Crosses on the same day in the same action. Perhaps it doesn't want to be remembered in India today, but nevertheless, that's a fact.
You're absolutely right. And yeah, sorry, I didn't have time to mention anything about Thomas Stuart Macpherson. But But yeah, exactly. That's a very interesting connection. And yeah, yeah, exactly. There were Macphersons fighting during the Great Uprising, let's say so. And yeah, there's people died as well during this. Yeah, exactly. But yeah, so Thomas Stuart Macpherson, I don't know a lot about him, but he seems to be a fascinating character. I was very interested in the Aberdeen connections because of the sky, etc., etc. But again, it's not. When you go into the 19th century, it's not just the Skye Macphersons in India; it's also the Badenoch Macphersons. But it's quite complex. There are a lot of them. Yeah.
Yes, a lot of Macphersons in Empire. Absolutely, it's fascinating. I think it's a really interesting strand here has emerged about the multilingual nature of these Macphersons, and how that very often comes from a Gaelic-speaking background, like Sir Thomas Stuart. Having that grounding in Gaelic, I think, then prepares you to work in a world where you're speaking multiple languages. I think that there's a really interesting elements of that sort of linguistic prowess that comes from being part of the Gaeltacht. That's absolutely fascinating.
Definitely, it's why I'm very intrigued by the fact that he was, or maybe only a Gaelic speaker who managed to find his way to India. That's very interesting, because from what I've seen in the 18th century Macphersons, most of them were bilingual. Someone like James Macpherson was a fluent Gaelic speaker. Surgeon was a Gaelic speaker as well. Slightly different was on Skye. There's a family of Gaelic Kirk ministers, so scholars. But this is something interesting. You have letters written in Gaelic between James and John Macpherson, and it was used as a code to protect information from English eyes. So that's very interesting, and it's probably quite difficult as as an historian to trace back this, because we have letters from these two influential figures. But what about the rest? What about the others Macpherson? Did they use Gaelic in day-to-day life, among themselves, to maintain a sense of sort of Highland identity? Because they were displaced in a totally different world, full of Irish, Welsh, English, European even. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's fascinating. The great Gaelic scholar Donald William Stewart, based at Samarostig, describes Highland involvement in the empire as a Gaelosphere. So not an Anglosphere, a Gaelosphere.
That's a great term, yeah.
A great term, yeah. Where that sense of Gaelic community and interconnection that is obviously there between Sir John and James is also something that other Highlanders are replicating. I've no idea to what extent the likes of Colonel Allen are using Gaelic in their time in India, but yeah, it's that there's something there, isn't there? The Gaelosphere is fascinating.
Definitely, yeah.
Idea
it's interesting.
to play with.
It's also interesting to see how the Skye Macphersons and the Badenoch Macphersons meet each other through Gaelic, in a sense. Sir John Macpherson was very interested in Gaelic. I don't know much about the relation of the 19th century Indian Macphersons to Gaelic, if they kept that link. But Sir John Macpherson, in his will, he bequeathed a huge amount of money to King's College Aberdeen to create actually it wasn't a chair, but it was a bursary for Highland students and Gaelic-speaking students, because he wanted Gaelic to be alive. So I don't think we can describe it in contemporary terms, as a sort of a definition of a nation or something like that. It's more the preservation of a Highland identity, a Highland network, or patronage as well.
Yeah, absolutely fascinating. I've got some questions about Sir John and Sir Hugh that I'll come back to, but don't want to hog the floor. Any other questions for Thomas? Anything else that folks would like to ask? I think while folks think that's my prompt to ask my burning questions. So it's absolutely fascinating to see where Sir John Macpherson's money goes. That's something that's always bugged me, because he returns from India with £500,000 in 1780s values, doesn't he? It's an absolutely huge sum of money, tens upon tens of millions of pounds. And I didn't know about the money going closely to Sir Hugh. So you mentioned that the Sir Hugh then, sorry, not Sir Hugh, Professor Hugh, he then purchases egg, which is fascinating. But what else does he do with the money? What other things happens to Sir John's money once it goes to Hugh?
That's a good question. I mentioned the Gallic bursaries in King's College. There was a substantial sum of money in the London stock. And among the executors, they were Hugh Macpherson. There was also his direct family, but clearly not on the top. So the people who benefited the most from his money was actually Dr. Hugh Macpherson. Yes, it's a good question. I've done a lot of work on James Ossian Macpherson, and the way he repatriated his money. For Sir John is slightly more complicated because he also lost a lot of money afterwards. He was always desperately in need for money, and he also carry on his, how could we say, like spin doctor activities, you may say so. So from London, he was still advising the Nabob of Arcot's sons, meaning that he also invested money. But it's quite, it's very difficult to find, especially, again, James Macpherson was an oddity for the reasons I described, but Sir John is also an oddity because never married. James never married as well, but he had children. Sir John never had children. It's also a different thing. He bought, I know that the money, he invested the money in London. He bought a house, a farm actually. But again, we can't really, it's an interesting choice. Why not Scotland? I know that James Ossian Macpherson said, as a real nabob, you should come back to Scotland as soon as possible and buy an estate in Scotland. He wasn't really considering that. I think he had a very complicated relation to the Western Isles, and also to his Presbyterian upbringing. I think he deliberately chose London for two reasons: close to the center of British politics, and also because when he came back, he wanted to establish himself as a European figure. So when you're down in London, you're actually closer to the continent. But his money was involved in the farm, not a huge, the farm was quite modest. I contacted archives in Sussex, and they told me, yeah, it's quite a minor purchase for a man like him, you know. it's incredibly small. He was a man of image, of self-fashioning, in a different way than James Ossian Macpherson was. James Macpherson was, you know, he was more interested in clan imagination, and he was entertaining everyone. In the letters, the tenants referred to him as Fingal, or Ossian, like the names of the people mentioned in the epic. Can you imagine that? You mention after the names of only someone who writes bestseller can do that. Sir John is a different story, and Sir John was more looking like towards sort of gentleman country farm model, and he didn't rely on the money from the lands, from his estate. It's a good question. Where did the money go?
And that's a fascinating contrast between James and Sir John, and Sir John's reluctance to become the classic returning Highland nabob and doing what James had done, what Sir Hector Munro had done. God, if I only had bought out the MacDonalds, and then perhaps the disasters of the 19th century wouldn't have happened.
Perhaps
my ancestors wouldn't have been so miserable.
I'm so sorry, Jim.
Oh, the great what if Sir John had invested in Sky. Oh well.
Just something coming to my mind right now. Sir John Macpherson encouraged people to buy lands in Scotland, but he did buy lands in Badenoch actually in the 1780s, 1790s. James Ossian Macpherson said, maybe you should buy a few lands because, you know, the Skye, Badenoch friendship, you should do something. This is weird. So we've got a sort of intrusion of the Skye Macphersons in Badenoch, but the lands were actually sold to the Duke, I think the Duke of Gordon, a few years later. So it wasn't something, you know, really considerable, but still.
Oh, fascinating stuff. Wonderful. Grand. Any final questions for Thomas? Anything else that folks would like to ask? Ooh, well, I think we'll wrap things up there. Well, thank you very much, Thomas, for a wonderful, entertaining, illuminating talk. Absolutely fascinating. And if we could end with another round of applause for Thomas's fine talk. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, thanks for everyone. That's a great turnout honestly on the Saturday night. So
Absolutely.
very honored, very happy.
Absolutely.
It's also good to see some some local faces and people who helped me also with my research over the last few years. So yeah.
No, that's terrific.
Thanks a lot.
And I'd usually use this opportunity to advertise our next event, but Isla, I'm not entirely sure what we do have lined up next. This is sort of the close of the last chunk of talks. Do we have anything else that we need to inform folks about at this moment?
Not currently. We'll put something online soon. Hopefully, or well, it should tie in with our temporary exhibition on landscapes, living landscapes. That's the title. So there will be some more talks that connect to that, but it will be in about a month's time or so when they take off again.
So keep your eyes peeled, look out on all our social media channels, and we'll look forward to seeing folks at whatever events occur in the near future. So thank you everyone again. Thank you very much, Thomas, and bye.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, nice seeing you.
Thank you, Thomas.
Bye. Thanks a lot.